sleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house? And she tossed out in the wild night sky to land who knows where. Oh, and she was tossed out into the wild night sky to land who knows where. Her shivering grew uncontrollable. You asked her to have the attic bedroom, she told herself savagely. Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane. It isn't a privilege, she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed, so she's thinking to herself. These are thoughts she's having. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge, innocent eyes. Go back to sleep, Meg said. Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me. She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, barring a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her moose brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame. In spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to offer, she could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. Fortinbras. It's a dog name. He must be frightened, too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. That's his name. What the heck does Fortinbras mean? I wonder if it's a word. Suddenly, let's see here.
Yeah, what does Fortinbras mean?
I don't know. Let's see.
Yeah, let's see.
If it means anything. I didn't get it. All I got was fortitude.
What?
Fortitude. That's it. Suddenly she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she'd heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murrays. Oh. Yeah. For the Murrays' house right now, isolated on a back road as it was. And this time, maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip, on top of everything else, she thought. Next she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. Why must everything happen to me? She demanded off a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, in her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing again at her glasses as though they could help her to see better in the dark. Denny's was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners and good at games, and when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy and Dennis. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time, then, for it would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care. Anyhow, I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. That'll cheer me up. And if the roof blows off, well, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there alone in the big old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you."
I said that, or I heard of that already.
You read that one?
Yeah.
From under the table where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his nail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny, abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Yewen setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all his own. "Why didn't you come up to the attic?" Meg asked, her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age. "I've been scared stiff." "Too windy up in that attic of yours?" the little boy said. "I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now." How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew or seemed to care what Denny or
Mommy.
Sandy were thinking.
The water.
Okay, listen. It was his mother's mind, and Meg's, that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about the Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright? Can you sit down and listen?
Yeah.
Just sit. Don't turn the light on. Turn the light back off.
Okay.
Just sit. That's all you have to do.
No, what the heck?
I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children, Meg had once overheard. The 2 boys seemed to be nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and that baby boy certainly aren't all there. It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learned to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. "Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg," her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. "There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does